Yeah, so there's a lot of crossover with our commentary today, but mine does focus a little bit on the primary election. So recently, Elizabeth Warren was asked a question about Joe Biden's candidacy and what the future holds for this election. Take a look.
Shoot to help by telling people, go to joebiden.com, pitch in your $5, send some text, volunteer some time, because it truly is the case. We are all in this now, and we have seen the importance of having a leader that we can count on in a crisis. It's not Donald Trump, it is Joe Biden.
If he asked you to be his running mate, would you say yes?
Yes.
Yeah, of course. So when I watched that video, I couldn't help but think about how strange it was that a woman who identified as someone who only got involved in politics because she was so disgusted with Joe Biden's bankruptcy bill. How did it get to the point where she's on national television urging people to donate to his campaign, and also saying, before the question can even, be asked completely, that she would 100% serve as his VP? And rather than getting upset about it, I think that we should use this as a teachable moment to think about what differentiated Elizabeth Warren's theory of change compared to Bernie Sanders and his theory of change. Now, there was a big difference, big way of differentiating themselves. And I don't think there was enough focus on that. While Bernie Sanders wanted to empower people to organize and push for change, Elizabeth Warren tried to sell this ridiculous notion that you can accomplish significant structural economic changes within a capitalistic system if you work with the very bad actors who have fought tooth and nail to keep this system intact. Now, we clearly know that if you believe in that theory of change, you're more likely to be malleable in your policy proposals. So while she started off as being, pretty progressive in some of her policy proposals, later she shifted to a more centrist position. Now, for the sake of this argument, let's just pretend or let's just give her the benefit of the doubt and say that she was sincere in the policy proposals that she put out in the beginning of her candidacy, in the beginning of this primary. The truth is, you have to concede to what corporate Democrats want in order to work with them. And this is what we've seen with corporate Democrats reaching across the aisle to work with Republicans. More often than not, they end up conceding to what Republican lawmakers want. In this case, we're talking about a so-called progressive saying that she's going to change the system by, reaching a little, across the aisle, a little shorter, right, to work with Democrats to get these incredibly important policies that should be considered human rights, like Medicare for all. And then in order to do that, she ended up kneecapping the one presidential candidate, Bernie Sanders, who was closest to her in these policy proposals, right? She went on national TV, argued that he said something sexist to her, which has not been in any way verified. That was in the news cycle for 2 weeks straight. And what did she get out of all of that? By kneecapping someone who should be her ally, she got nothing. She got nothing. And what we're learning now through CNBC is that the people who have been funding Joe Biden's campaign are urging him to stay away from Elizabeth Warren as a potential VP pick. So I want to give you the details on that. Brian Schwartz over at CNBC reports that conversations have recently included attempts to push the Biden campaign away from picking Warren and encouraging the choice of other candidates purportedly on the list, such as Senators Kamala Harris and Amy Klobuchar and Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. But it gets worse. I want to give you some of the exact statements some of them have made. So these Wall Street donors, according to the reporting, said in private that they plan to sit out or back Trump instead if she went on to capture the party's nomination. That is something that we need to really focus on, right? Because when we have conversations about how similar corporate Democrats are to Republicans, this is why. Because they have similar donors who have a very similar agenda, and they want to do anything and everything possible to maintain and protect this rigged economic system. There's no question about it. And so how are you as a progressive going to work with a politician who has a financial incentive to go against you? It's just not going to happen. You're not going to build a coalition with so-called moderate Democrats. They hate us because their political careers literally rely on them hating us and fighting us. One of the Biden donors told CNBC, I think a lot of the donor base on board and coming would prefer almost anyone but Elizabeth. I don't see him choosing her for Veep. Now, keep in mind, these are statements that were given by Biden donors after Warren conceded to the corporate arm of the Democratic Party, after Warren said that she would do fundraising on Biden's behalf, after Warren pivoted away from Medicare for all. That wasn't good enough for them. They still see her as a threat. One other executive said she would be horrible. He would lose the election, something that maybe you would agree with, Michael, which we'll come back to in just a minute.
That's a guy who's looking out for the Democrats to win.
Exactly. And then finally, John Morgan, who's a Florida businessman, actually went on record. Everyone else was anonymous. He said, there are two Elizabeth Warrens. The one I had in my home when she was a U.S. senator and consumer champion. She was awesome. Then came Warren, the socialist, trying to out Bernie. That is her dilemma. But I would argue that she did not try to out Bernie. She moved to the center very quickly. And more importantly, again, going back to her theory of change, she didn't want to empower workers to have the control over how this system changed. She wanted to work with the same power players to reform the system. But again, you're not going to be able to do that if these power players are corrupted by these Wall Street millionaires and billionaires. And I want to give you a few examples of who has been funding the Biden campaign. His top donors include $8 million from Paloma Partners. That's an asset and wealth management firm. This is only for the 2020 election. $3 million from investment firm Euclidean Capital. $3 million from real estate investment firm Marcus and Millichap. $1.5 million from venture capital firm Greylock Partners. He is not going to give them the middle finger to implement progressive policy proposals that Elizabeth Warren is pushing for. It's just not going to happen. It's not. So again, when we're thinking about politicians, when we're thinking about their candidacy, when we're thinking about electing the right people to represent our best interests, yes, it's important to focus on policy, but I would argue it's even more important to focus on their theory of change.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think, the reason it's important to keep teasing out how big of a disaster the whole Warren debacle was is for two reasons. One, and I'll be a little bit unfashionable here, I actually think that that Donald Trump needs to be defeated. Now, is that going to be the core of where my focus is? Am I going to tell anybody, as I keep saying, a bedtime story about how the Democratic Party is changing and Biden is persuadable? 100% not. No, definitely not. However, I would definitely prefer to be fighting an exhausted neoliberal Democratic Party, which is bad enough, versus an actually much more capable and insurgent right-wing populism, frankly, right now. So partially this matters because you have the people who are the most sanctimonious and hyperventilating the most and vote-shaming people the most, who are then turning around and pushing for somebody electorally who brings nothing to the ticket. This is somebody who is mediocre numbers in her home state, which is a comfortable Democratic state, who finished 5th in the primary, and whose only natural base is amongst liberal journalists, and in terms of vote shares, was exclusively, in terms of aggregate numbers. Obviously, you can find individual exceptions for anything, but overall, I mean, her voting base was affluent, overeducated white people. And that's not a moral, great. That's sure, compete for your votes, but that is not enough people remotely to pull anything. And you see people still saying oh, I can't wait to look at her dunk on Pence. Well, okay, sure. I mean, I guess have your West Wing moment, but I'd actually like to see Donald Trump lose. And I say that as a Bernie bro, who has nothing but contempt for most of these journalists and for Warren and for Biden. So, and secondly, I think it was, this was another big split in terms of how to deal with Warren, that functionally her role was as a spoiler and in terms of dividing energy from Bernie, but also it showed that in just exactly what you're saying, that people were fixated on this and that policy position, and then all of these like markers of overeducated people, like smartness and oh my God, she was at this law school and so smart, so smart. Who gives a fuck? Like, I don't care what somebody's SAT scores were. Again, Lula's the most extraordinary president of the 21st century, didn't go to college. So it also correlates in a way that will be politically advantageous for us with letting go of all of these elitist, boring, and repulsive markers about what intelligence means and people's little narrow obsessions, which most people find very off-putting.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad that you mentioned the whole emphasis on being educated and being smart, because, in 2016, I think a blind spot for me personally, just to be completely vulnerable with the audience, was not understanding where the accusations of elitism were coming from, toward the Democratic Party specifically. Because I'm like, wait, so you're elitist if you have thoughts on these things, if you've researched these things and you want to share your point of view, why is that elitist? But I'm now understanding very clearly that it's this, just like this presentation of I'm educated, so I'm right. I'm educated, so I'm better. I'm educated, so I'd be a better leader. And I think that definitely turns people off, especially in a day and age where higher education is increasingly becoming unattainable for the vast majority of people in this country. It's so outrageously expensive. So when you create a system where it's unattainable for people and then you tell everyone like, I'm better than you because I have an education and you don't, yeah, that turns people off to your party. It turns people off to your candidacy. And we need to be sensitive to the type of language we use when we communicate these things.
100%. And I'll just really reinforce. And I know you and I have also talked about this. Like, I genuinely don't buy it either, right? I'm not saying, it's not like a crude populist. Although I want to also take back the word populist, but whatever. It's not to say that scientific knowledge doesn't matter. It's not to say like, oh, I got a little thing called common sense. Like, that's also bullshit. That's its own way of trying to create cultural capital. But in their own terms, I do not at all accept that somebody who has been trained in a narrow set of test taking and social practices and knows how to present in a certain way equals intelligence. I don't think it does not equal structural understanding of how the economy works. It doesn't equal the emotional and social capacities to actually reach out to people and build coalitions and do and accomplish things. And it also, has its own, its own cliches, its own redundancies. We go and we look at certain parts of liberal progressive media. We know what the perspective is going to be on everything. We know what the hot takes are going to be. We know that, it's not even going to be, in so many cases, not even like correct, but also willing to explore bigger arguments. It has its own moralism, its own cliches and knee-jerk reactions. And I think it's a huge problem, both on the merits itself, because degrees do not equal intelligence. It doesn't mean that you don't have intelligence, but it doesn't equal intelligence. And also, again, as we've just been saying, it's repulsive to a vast majority of voters in the electorate.
Absolutely.